My name is Martin Plaut. I'm the author of Promise and Despair, which is a book that looks at South Africa in the early part of the 20th century, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies.
So please start by telling me about how the apartheid government took cues from the Jim Crow system in the American South.
Well, the South Africans, particularly the whites obviously, were interested in the way in which repression could be maintained in South Africa in the early 20th century through looking to inspiration and forms of repression that existed in the American South. And this wasn't something that just took place in South Africa. Across the white world, so to speak, in places like Australia and in Canada and in New Zealand, all of them looked to inspiration from the American South, and they then incorporated elements of this in their own way, in their own governments, in the way that they dealt with native peoples.
And how is the inverse true? How did the anti-apartheid movement draw cues from the civil rights movement in the American context?
Well, essentially what happened was that people began to see that the African American population were already doing things which they could learn from as well. So both sides learned from America, and you get people coming over in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, coming to see Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, and basically learning from them and getting inspiration. And this really made a huge impact on the way that people thought about things, the way that they developed their ideas. And they also then brought and encouraged American bishops, black American bishops, to come to South Africa, and those ideas also rubbed off on people. So it was a genuinely a rounded relationship, and there weren't just a few people that came over. It started off with musical groups going over to America, and then gradually there was a choir that very famously went from South Africa, and then gradually there were other groups that came over and learned. It was an educational process, but it was also a highly political process. So that by, I suppose, the beginning of the First World War, you can say that there was a real looking to the Americans for a way of moving forward. And of course, one shouldn't forget that in 1912, the African National Congress is actually founded. And some of those people would have had not only experience of America, but have had this inspiration. And that made a huge impact on people in South Africa, and really was a vitally important element.
And can you talk a little bit about how these states are being played out in your book, Promise and Despair? What are the events you describe there?
Well, what I tried to do was to trace the way in which all of this developed. And I think it's one of the interesting phenomenon of South Africa, that the black population didn't get the vote in 1994 with Nelson Mandela and the end of apartheid. It actually got it in 1850s. So from that period onwards, any person, certainly in the Cape, who had money, and of course was a man, because I'm afraid this was only a male franchise, could vote. And that was what they got gradually, became entrenched in the South African system, particularly in the Cape. And when the Union of South Africa is formed in 1910, then there's an aim is to bring that into the rest of South Africa. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. The British didn't give that kind of non-racial constitution. And I'm afraid that when the 1910 constitution is approved by London, it is a racial constitution, and only whites have the vote, except in the Cape, where the black vote continued into the 1930s. But I'm afraid it was a tragic moment in South African history that the British frankly let down the majority population in South Africa and did not insist on a non-racial constitution.